Welcome back to the final part. Please like, subscribe and enjoy. Chapter 4. All according to plan. Wesker had perfected the Ouroboros virus and it was now time to send it raging through his new world. The natural selection was about commence. It was time for global saturation. Wesker sat upon his throne, a glass of wine in his hand and the world chained to his every whim. He smiled. The news broadcasted the return of Albert Wesker and how he had come to control the whole earth. Wesker now ran every country through his pawns. He flipped his phone open and began making the calls. One by one, the nukes were set off. Day by day, countries fell to the virus. Very few survived, very few were worthy. A week passed. Wesker's reign as god was going splendidly. Or so he thought. Jake awoke suddenly. He looked around, his head thumping and his ears ringing. What? He looked down at himself, his body a mass of veins and protruding spikes. He screamed out in terror and hatred. He looked around. Chris and Jill lay dead. Chris had been mutated and lay still while Jill was unrecognizable. Jake tried to see if Chris were still alive and found out to his surprise, he was. Jake awoke Chris. Chris came to his senses and upon seeing the dead body of Jill and the state of his own body, he flew into a rage. How could this have happened? Chris looked down at the dead body of Jill and tears began streaming down his face. He then noticed something clutched tight in her hand, an unused needle filled with Ouroboros virus. Chris scanned the floor around him and found a shattered needle labeled C virus. Jill had saved his life. Chris stayed there for hours, cradling the lifeless body of his wife, wishing he had died instead of her, and then he stopped. He was going to kill Wesker no matter what it took. The Ouroboros virus hadn't reached Israel yet, as well as a few other countries. Chris got on a plane to one of those countries, Turkey. This was where Sherry Birkin was operating out of. She had fled her previous home after hearing of the return of Wesker and his ascension to godhood. Chris wore his hazmat suit, reinforced and airtight. He got into the base Sherry worked out of, perfecting samples of Jake's blood. "Are you okay?" Sherry yelled, shocked at the appearance of Chris. "No, I'm not okay. Give me some C-virus antidote," yelled Chris. He wanted to go after Wesker but he couldn't think clearly when he was infected like this. Sherry put Chris to sleep with a shot of antidote and set him in a room to rest and recover. Sherry knew the Ouroboros virus would spread globally very soon. It was only a matter of time, and a short amount of time at that. Even if Wesker were killed, there was no way anyone would be safe. Now everyone's lives were left up to natural selection. Sherry had no doubt Chris could survive if he were in peak condition, although if he were to be infected now, he would most definitely die. She crossed her legs and sat down on her sofa. Tears streamed from her face as she could only imagine the horrors Jake was suffering. A week passed. Chris was healed up nicely. He got out of bed and went over to open the door to his quarters and it was locked. He didn't know the password to get out. Another week passed before Chris managed to break out. He punched through the bulletproof glass and got out. Immediately his lungs were filled with Ouroboros virus. He collapsed on the floor, frantically looking around only to spot Sherry dead on the ground. He struggled to his feet, the virus quickly spreading through his nervous system. Chris woke up. He had survived the virus and he felt strong. He decided he was going to go and kill Wesker, and that was that. Suddenly his eyes dilated and he fell to his knees. There was a red spider machine strapped to back of Chris' neck that he hadn't noticed before. He was now under the control of Albert Wesker, a slave to his every whim. Meanwhile Jake had just found Wesker. He leapt up the skyscraper Wesker was presiding in and Superman punched him in the face. "You're dead," he screamed. Wesker, without even the slightest show of shock, stood. "Well then, son, here for some father-son bonding," said Wesker in a sinister voice as he dashed at Jake at top speed. Jake tried to react to it with a dodge but it was too late. Wesker leaned into Jake with a powerful knee cannon, splitting Jake's jaw from his face completely. Jake staggered backward but immediately rushed back into the fray and attempted to deliver a cobra strike of his own. But Wesker was so enhanced now that he had Ouroboros. He was god level. He ran so fast he could not be seen and appearing behind Jake impaled him with his arm, which he transformed into a sword-like weapon at will. Wesker stood over his son. A god can never be defeated by a mortal. He laughed and kicked Jake's body out the window of the 77-story building. There was not a single person on Earth who could challenge him, not a one. Evolution would now take its course. Delicious, isn't it? Wesker thought to himself. He had made Chris his slave. Chris would do many evil things for his new god Wesker, but what was so great about it was Chris realized what he was doing, he just couldn't help but do it. He killed off many BSAA members who had once been his friends, and he didn't it without shedding a tear, that is, not on the outside. Chapter 5. Humanity's Last Hope. Ada Wong and Leon struggled to reach the door. They collapsed upon entering the building but slowly stumbled to their feet. Ada dropped Leon, his face now shriveling and blistering up. His hazmat suit had been torn and his gas mask as well while he was hit by a sploder on his way there. Ada looked down at Leon. She hadn't shown much emotion or expressed her feelings toward him before. "I love you," she said with a tear streaming down her face. Leon coughed. Blood landed upon Ada's face. "I know, Ada, I love you too," said Leon with a hoarse voice as his last breath left him. Ada cradled him in her arms and cried, but only for a short time. She still had a job to do. She was working for no organization this time, rather, for the world. Ada surveyed the room and found her gaze falling upon the seemingly lifeless body of Miss Sherry Birkin. Ada rushed over to see if she were still alive. She would be needed for this plan to work. Ada slowly turned Sherry face up. She looked as if she were sleeping. "Are you all right?" Ada yelled. Sherry's eyes squinted as she slowly opened them and said in a muffled voice, "Ada Wong. What are you here for? You aren't wearing any gas mask, you're going to die." Ada shrugged. She had given her gas mask to Leon after his was severely damaged. "We need you to make antibodies out of Jill Valentine's blood," yelled Ada. Sherry slowly picked herself up from off the shining white floor. "Well, I am going to need Jill Valentine then," said Sherry. Ada handed Sherry a sample of Jill's blood contained in a vial. "I took this after I saw her die and before Wesker's men confiscated her body," said Ada. Sherry was shocked, but there was no time to waste. She stumbled into her lab and closed the airtight doors. Ada struggled and crawled her way back over to Leon so she could hold him before she died. Few days passed as Sherry worked as quickly as she could on the virus. Sweat dripped off her brow as she wiped her hand across her forehead. She looked down at the steaming sample of Jill's blood. Sherry had incorporated Jill's blood sample with Jake's. This would make for a powerful antibody. It would not make you immune to the Ouroboros virus, but it would help to withstand it. Sherry would now administer it to herself and find someone who could retrieve the body of Jill Valentine. She knew Chris hadn't died, but she also knew that he was now working with Wesker. She had heard that on the news. Sherry administered the blood into herself. She then opened her doors and began her trip to the airport. She was going to go and save Chris. She knew this was a suicide mission, but what better idea did she have? Sherry snuck over behind a mutated civilian and slowly reached her hands just behind his head. Then, placing her hand over his mouth, she quickly slit his throat. She jumped on his van and reversed over his body before speeding off to the airport. Sherry got to the airport and it was filled with zombies. Her hazmat suit face mask was already almost broken. Sherry snuck past all the higher evolutionary beings, zombies, and got inside of the plane. She had never flown one herself before, but she had to take the wheel. Sherry opened the door to the captain's quarters but was immediately attacked. The captain snapped at her with his dog-like maw and swung his chainsaw arms at her. Sherry leapt back and upon landing on her back fired off shot after shot from her triple-shot handgun. She watched as the captain collapsed, but then suddenly, she heard a mass of screams and zombies running outside. The captain had signaled them with his screams. Sherry took hold of the wheel and began flying as quickly as possible. She could hear the zombies climbing atop the plane and trying to rip it apart. Luckily she escaped. Sherry crash-landed in America, very near Wesker's tower, where he was presiding and ruling over the world. She spat blood all over the ground as she quickly removed her hazmat suit since it was now useless. She had crashed since she had been burned badly by the acidic spit of the captain that had just then eaten through the and burned into her skin. Sherry lay in her seat. Her wounds were healing. She staggered out of the plane, her wounds having healed nicely. Her clothes were in tatters. Her scarf had fallen off. Her pants cut down to short shorts and her shirt was torn all over the place. She rushed over to the door of Wesker's tower but couldn't get it open. She then saw a small break in the wall, probably from a monster. She picked up a slab of cement and broke the wall in further, gaining access to the tower. She had been able to fight off the effects of Ouroboros longer than most due to her healing factor and antibodies, but she knew she would die soon. She heard voices coming from a nearby room, one of them, the voice of Chris. She waited outside for Chris to come out. Luckily only Chris came out. Sherry immediately tackled him from behind and immediately began tearing at the device on his back. She had seen it on him when watching a broadcast of him massacring innocents. Chris smacked Sherry off his back and turned around with his gun pointed at her, but Sherry quickly explained that he needed to go and find Jill's body. Chris' head began to hurt. Sherry told him what he was doing, how Wesker had killed Jill. Chris with an angry roar turned around and tore the device off him. He turned to Sherry and realizing she could die without any armor to keep her protected, he busted back in the door he had come, immediately opening fire and killing everyone inside. He grabbed a suit of armor for Sherry. She slipped her petite body into it. It was a bit baggy but it would do nicely. Chris and Sherry began making their way to where Jill Valentine lay. Wesker watched from his security camera. Interesting, it looks like Chris and I aren't finished just yet, said Wesker to himself as he began his descent down the stairs. Sherry zipped up Jill's body bag and was ready to haul it back. I have no way of getting off this country, said Sherry. There is a helicopter on top of this building. Take that and get out of here, yelled Chris. Sherry began dragging the body of Jill along with her as she struggled to make it to the helipad. Chris, now I see I was wrong in letting you live. I will kill you here and now, said Wesker as he also motioned for his men to go after Sherry. Wesker dashed at Chris but Chris grabbed Wesker and body slammed him ferociously. You're going to die for what you have done, yelled Chris. Wesker realized Chris was going to be more of a challenge now that he had survived the Ouroboros virus. But Wesker knew Chris couldn't fully control it. He was not worthy. Wesker and Chris fought through room after room, shattering through walls and sending each other flying. Wesker grabbed Chris by the throat and began crushing his neck. Chris grabbed Wesker by his throat and did the same. Wesker transformed his arms into giant tentacles and pulled Chris off of him, whipping him through a wall. Wesker then leapt atop Chris and tore his heart out with his bare hands. Tisk, tisk Chris. You are not worthy of my new world that I, your God, graciously gave you the chance to live in. Now die, said Wesker with a sly smirk as he crushed Chris' heart in his hand, killing Chris immediately. Wesker had been happy controlling Chris like a puppet and making him suffer every day, but oh, it was so much sweeter tearing him to shreds piece by piece, Wesker thought. Sherry kicked the remaining Javot from the helicopter as she began to fly again. Just then Wesker appeared. He looked at her with a look of sarcastic pity. Come now dear, said Wesker, you cannot fight God and you cannot fight evolution. Sherry shot him right between the eyes. HMPH, not unexpected, said Wesker as he rushed at the helicopter. She shot 2 missiles that were located on the front of the helicopter at him, blasting his directly. Sherry looked on, triumphantly. Sherry, 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 Wesker remarked as he walked out of the flames completely unharmed. That will not be enough to save your precious world. He laughed as he sent his elongated arms surging through the ground and starting a tornado of Ouroboros tentacles which tore Sherry's helicopter apart, sending it spiraling out of control and exploding midair. Wesker knew there was to be some resistance after he took control and became God. What ruler can't expect that? But Wesker is always one step ahead. I suppose I should thank you, Alex, said Wesker to himself. You were sorely mistaken in thinking you would surpass me, God. But your research has benefited me much. He chuckled as he ran his hand across the smooth surface of the mind transfer device. This world will never see the end of my reign. Wesker walked out onto the top of the tower, cameras trained on him. Now, I will issue my commandments for this world to live by, exclaimed Wesker as the whole world looked on in terror.